Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? And hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would end up, kind of re reviewing one of my most recent videos, kind of talking about some of the conversations that I just recently had. And I do apologize for not getting to the comments or the conversations earlier, and of course, in this video, I may also talk about the up and coming Tyson Fury fight, as well as the up and coming Lamont Roach versus William Zepeda fight that I believe was recently announced. But I kind of wanted to talk about this first because this has been a conversation on my channel for a long time, that has kind of attracted a certain amount of viewers. And on top of that, always attracted a certain amount of attention. And people may wonder, what my personal perspective is, on some of these questions. But I made a video, the other day in a response to a comment I believe made by him in sports media on my channel, who of course is a channel that I've reviewed once or twice in the past. Mainly the reason why I'm dealing over the Canelo and Crawford fight. But, that being stated, overall, Crawford, for anyone who's been around on my, channel for a very long time would know that although I hold him in a great amount of respect and that although I do look at him as an all-time great level fighter, that I do not think that his resume holds up to certain guys such as Sugar Ray Leonard or Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Manny Pacquiao or certain guys like that. And to be quite honest with you, even for certain people of his own generation, you can debate that there are certain fighters that have, better resumes than that of a Crawford, or at least slightly better resumes in terms of more A grade level fighters. Now, that being stated, Crawford, after the Saul Canelo Alvarez win, and of course also after the Errol Spence win, his resume definitely did go up quite a bit. But the reason why, I was very reluctant to put Terrence Bud Crawford as the for sure number one pound for pound fighter for such a long time was because for such a long time, for many, many years, Terrence Bud Crawford's best wins were over Yuriorkis Gamboa and Victor Postal. And to be quite honest with you, that really was about it, And Terrence Bud Crawford always was a great fighter. He was someone that always look to, appease the eye when it comes to that of his true boxing style. He's someone that, overall always passed that of the eye test. But in terms of the actual results and the actual A grade level fighters that he would fight, no, Terrence Bud Crawford, just in my personal view, he never was officially the true number one pound for pound fighter until he defeated that of an Errol Spence Jr. And a lot of people, of course, disagree with that, and of course, a lot of the Bud fans, they've come on my channel and claim that, I am a Bud hater and all sort of stuff. Terrence Bud Crawford not only is from my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska, but he has been one of my favorite fighters to watch. He is a phenomenal fighter. He's someone that, overall, I think is one of the greater fighters of all time, one of the greatest fighters of all time, and also is one of the most skilled and entertaining fighters to watch. There's no doubt, especially after the recent wins that Terrence Bud Crawford was able to get over both Errol Spence and Canelo Alvarez, that Terrence Bud Crawford has to be remembered, as one of the greatest boxers of all time. I don't think that there's any doubt about that. Now, where this comes in is that, the reason why I kind of made this video is because there are always so many comparisons with that of a Terrence Bud Crawford, Oleksandr Usyk, and Inoue especially, about resume and what they've done and all that sort of stuff. And I've told people just in my view that Inoue, although he is a great fighter, he's someone that at the moment I cannot place truly at the number one pound for pound spot because he's never even fought an official top 10 level pound for pound fighter. If you're number one pound for pound on my list, you have to at the very least usually, fight a number one, or excuse me, not a number one, but a top 10 pound for pound level fighter on the top 10 pound for pound list. And Tyson Fury was looked at that on multiple lists, including my list. In a way, of course, he did fight Stephen Fulton, and of course, he once upon a time fought Nonito Donaire. But I don't believe that either of those fighters were top 10 level pound for pound. Donaire certainly was no longer top 10 pound for pound by the time that Inoue had fought him. But that being stated, we also had a conversation about, Inoue overall, and did he have a worse resume by the time that he was this age compared to that of Crawford? Because, of course, a couple of, videos that I ended up reviewing by that of John Boxing or someone else, or just other channels, they'll tell you that Terrence Crawford, that he had this phenomenal level resume even before he went up to 147. And to be honest with you, that is just not the case. Terrence Bud Crawford once again had two very good wins before he went on that streak of Sean Porter, Spence, Madrimov, and Canelo. He had Postani and Gamboa. Now, did he have other wins like Benavidez and Jeff Horn and, Felix Diaz, Ricky Burns, Ramon de Beltran, Julius Anango? Yeah, but none of those guys are really A-grade level fighters for people who really know them. So, I mean, it just is what it is. But we're going to get into all that. But I wanted to, talk about this because I kind of did a resume breakdown for, a little over an hour here. And I believe that there's this man here, boxing expert, Dash 12. Man, of course, stated that, he was possibly a little bit too condescending in his comments. It's all good. At times, I can come across as a little bit condescending, although, of course, I don't ever mean to. I'm not someone that, tries to. I can be very blunt. I can be very harsh with my critique. Which, of course, at times comes across as either a condescending or kind of jerkish, but, obviously I'm not trying to do that. Anyways, we're going to read this whole man's argument, and I'm going to kind of discuss it. Not really overall to argue in any, malicious way or anything like that, but to kind of just talk about it because I thought that, a bunch of these comments were very interesting, and I'm going to address a lot of your guys' comments in this video, but let's get into this guy because this guy wrote me a lot. So let's see. He said, "This is generally one of the worst resume breakdowns I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of bad ones. The entire foundation of your argument is built on a method that could be used to tear apart literally any fighter in history. Well, which tells you the method itself is broken. Well, in this video, I would somewhat technically agree. The reason why I responded to the comment of Hitman Sports Media was because what he was basically commenting was that he was basically completely ripping apart Oleksandr Usyk's resume in order to basically make sure that Crawford had the defined #1 spot of that era. And listen, if you think that Crawford is over Oleksandr Usyk, that's your business. I think that you can have a debate about that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. If you also were to have it the other way, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that either. But that being stated, the point is when you start to get into conversations and you just try to rip a man's resume and say, because Hitman Sports Media was saying that, oh, well, Tyson Fury was, a dope addict. He had wars with Wilder. He was, he damn near lost to an MMA fighter, coming up with all the excuses. And don't get it twisted. Fury did have a little bit, of rough fights with Wilder, but he mainly pretty much whooped his ass. So I don't think he suffered as much wear and tear as what people are alleging. Now, Wilder definitely suffered wear and tear. And I think that Fury probably suffered a bit of wear and tear, but he still was pretty much at the peak of his powers, or relatively at the peak of his powers. And of course he did nearly lose to Francis Ngannou, but I don't think that anyone would really say that Tyson Fury really took that fight anywhere near seriously as what he did the Oleksandr Usyk fight. He very clearly was out of shape in that Francis Ngannou fight, although it's a little bit hard to tell with him because he's always been a bit flabby. He had not a whole lot of stamina, and he was very limited in that fight because I don't think he expected Ngannou to actually be as good as what he was. So anyways, but that was actually kind of the point, overall of that video, because people use this with any fighter. I've seen it with Mayweather. I've seen it with Sugar Ray, which is why I also made the point in the video that you can do this with literally any fighter. So Hitman Sports Media, of course, was saying that Usyk fought Fury like this, and he fought this fighter like this, and blah, blah, blah. Well, Terence Crawford, and I've already stated this, he fought Gamboa when he pretty much was outsized by about 2 weight classes, and that is the truth of the matter. And on top of that, Gamboa had not fought in over a year, if you want to make that excuse. Now, in my personal view, that is not a viable enough excuse. Now, I think that the viable excuse is that Gamboa was clearly outsized. That's something in my view that is very viable, but the fact that Gamboa was off for a year, I've always stated this, sure, it does make you a little bit rusty, my personal view, but being off for just a year, in my view, does not, completely, give you a viable excuse to why you lost like that. And Gamboa still gave Crawford a very tough fight, so it was still obvious that he was at a relative peak of his powers. Sean Porter also was another fighter to where many people claim that he was not in his prime anymore. I'm not going to say that he was at his absolute peak, but he was still, in my view, in his relative prime. But that pretty much was the last fight because he would have never been the same had he returned. That was his first time being stopped by Terence Crawford, and I think that was the last little bit that he had left. But my point was that if we're going to make these excuses with AJ or Tyson Fury, and apparently Usyk beats them, not at a good point, then we should also use those same standards with Crawford. Because Crawford fought a Spence that was in multiple car accidents, and also a Spence that was off for 14 months. He fought a Gamboa that was outsized by a couple of weight classes and all for over a year. And he also fought a Sean Porter who was no longer a title holder and had wars with Ugas, Keith Thurman, Spence, and some of these other guys, Kell Brook. Madrimov only had 10 fights, and hadn't really ever fought anybody. And Canelo, we all know that he definitely was not at the peak of his powers. So, I mean, my point is this. If you want to use those standards for one fighter, no problem, but you should also use the standards for another fighter. And I've stated this about Crawford. The Crawford fans really should not talk like this because, once again, if there is any fighter that really had fought a lot of fighters that really were not at the peak of their powers, it really was Crawford. I mean, to me, and once again, I'm not going to state that with 100% certainty. I still think that he deserves great credit over Gamboa, Postal, and some of those guys in Canelo and Madrimov and Spence and Porter. I think that he deserves a grade level credit for all those guys. But if we're going to go by those standards, which in my view aren't always viable or doable, if we're going to be logical and objective, no problem. But then, you should keep the same standards. Because Crawford, once again, he fought Porter when he was no longer a champion and pretty much on his last legs. He fought Gamboa when he was clearly outsized and off for over a year, if you want to use that same type of standard. And he also fought, Errol Spence off of 14 months of a layoff and after multiple car accidents, if we're going to come up with all these little, mitigating excuses. But anyway, let's see. Um, let's see. But let's go through this anyway, since you clearly put a lot of time into being wrong. That's funny. You spent over an hour basically admitting Crawford has 6 A-grade wins and then trying to convince people that's not impressive. Well, once again, there was a reason why I did the standards in terms of, overall of that way. In my view, they are impressive. But once again, it was based off of the logic or the standards of someone else. But I understand. Anyway. Um, do you understand that 6A grade wins in the four belt era is historically elite? Naming the fighters from this generation with more. Go ahead. Canelo had a comparable number, depending on how strict you are. Usyk has a comparable number by your own count, and Inoue, who you're trying to prop up, has fewer confirmed A grade wins by your own criteria. I do tend to agree with that. Now Canelo, in my view, probably has about 11 A grade level wins on his resume. But the problem is with Canelo was that, he did lose to Bivol, he did lose to Mayweather, and he also lost to Crawford. So that's kind of the problem with Canelo. But no, Canelo always had the best resume of his era, kind of before he lost to that of a Crawford, because the amount of A-grade level names that he fought within like a 10-year span was, pretty phenomenal. Not even just a 10-year span, but really an 11-year span. Anyways, let's continue. But with the Inoue point, I agree that Inoue does not have a confirmed total of 6A grade level wins. And I agree that having 6A grade level wins can make you, an elite level fighter of this generation, which is why I once again made that video, because a lot of these standards, I've seen certain videos or reviewed certain videos where people will sit here and say, well, Usyk, he beat a weak cruiserweight division, all this sort of stuff. No, actually, Usyk be probably the strongest version of the cruiserweight division that we've ever seen, at least overall in terms of young undefeated talent. So that was, pretty much my point there. But anyways, let's see. You dismantled your own argument, David. Notice you spent an embarrassing amount of time talking about Gamboa's size and how Crawford had a reach advantage, as if Crawford chose Gamboa's skeletal structure. Well, it's understandable that Crawford obviously, can't control that. But that being stated, for anyone who knows me, I'm a complete stickler, overall for people that I either find to be weight bullies or have a massive size advantage. So there might be certain wins in boxing history that others, kind of give credit for, that personally, in my view, I, think is is a little bit overrated because of the size. So Oscar De La Hoya, for example, I'm not saying that Crawford's one of these guys, because in a lot of his bigger wins, I think that he was comparable actually with their size. The only one that I think that he was not comparable with their size was against that of Yuriorkis Gamboa. But anyway, but that being stated, for those of you that know me, you would know that I've always found Oscar De La Hoya to be a little bit overrated, because I found him to be a little bit of a weight bully, especially against guys like Pernell Whitaker and, Julio Cesar Chavez. Bernard Hopkins, although I think he's a great fighter, he's someone that also at times gets a little bit more limited credit for me, because, especially that Felix Tito Trinidad fight and the Oscar De La Hoya fight. Those two fights, he very clearly was fighting guys that really belong more at the 154-pound weight class. And Hopkins really could have easily fought at 168 to 175. But whenever Hopkins fought a real talent that could actually compete with his size, he pretty much lost. That's why Bernard Hopkins, for me, although he is a great fighter, he has been overrated over the years, just in my personal view. So anyone who knows me knows that I'm a stickler for guys that, I find to be either A-weight bullies or people that I find to be, having a clear size advantage. But anyway, and that's what makes certain fighters that can move up in weight, like that of a Usyk and, beat guys that are clearly bigger than him. Terrence Crawford, of course. I'm not going to say that Canelo, was quite as big against him as what some people were going to think that he was. But Terrence Crawford still clearly beat a bigger Canelo. So you got to give him a lot of props there. And of course, in a way, he's been defeating bigger fighters for, recent years. But, of course, he's going to have to fight higher level competition to be on the same level as a Crawford or a Usyk, just in my view. But the point is that, size is going to have to be talked about, but it depends on which way. But let's see. Gambo was the WBA and IBF featherweight champion, a legitimate world-class fighter who chose to move up. Well, I believe that he was the IBF featherweight champion. I don't believe that he was ever the official WBA champion. I think that he was the regular WBA champion, but I don't think that he was ever the official one. I could be wrong about that. But once again, the reason why I stated that was because Gamboa very clearly did not belong at 120, or excuse me, did not belong at 130 or 135, and Crawford even stated that in an interview. And he was correct. Gamboa did not belong there. But let's see. He was the betting favorite going into the Crawford fight. That is true. That's not Crawford's problem. And your logic here is hilarious. You're penalizing Crawford for being bigger than his opponent while simultaneously praising Usyk for beating guys who massively outweighed him. Well, yes, there's a reason for that. I think that you have to give more credit to guys who are actually able to move up in weight and beat bigger guys than that overall, of vice versa of guys who are bigger and beating the smaller guys. I think that you obviously have to give credit to guys that are a decent amount bigger, or excuse me, are smaller, and actually able to beat guys that are A-grade level fighters, and they're bigger than them. So when Manny Pacquiao ends up beating guys like, when he moves up in weight and beats Marco Antonio Barrera or Eric Morales, although they were comparable in size, when Manny Pacquiao beats someone like a Keith Thurman, who is legitimately bigger than him, when he, kind of beats other guys like Miguel Cotto, although I think there was like a weight clause for that, and other things like that. Yes, you have to give those fighters more credit than, say, a fighter fighting a great fighter, of their own same size, or if they are bigger than that said fighter. Yes, of course, you're going to have to give more credit to a fighter if they are, quote unquote, smaller than that fighter. That's how we determine who the greatest fighters of all time are, at least usually, if they're actually able to compete in multiple weight classes. But anyway. All right, so let's continue. Sorry, sorry, by the way, if my voice sounds different. I'm, recently got a cold. Anyways, but yeah. And for those of you, by the way, that say that I'm sick all the time, this is actually the first time I've been sick in a while. But anyways, thank you for the concern. But let's see. So size difference matters when it helps your narrative and doesn't when it hurts it. Got it. At least be consistent with where to go. At least be consistent with your own standards, which is ironic since you kept saying let's keep the same standards throughout the entire video while doing the exact opposite. Well, I agree with that, but once again, the reason why I did that was a response to a person. It wasn't because I was actually trying to discredit Crawford's resume. Once again, it was to use some sort of logic, kind of against that. Anyways, but that being stated, but once again, in terms of Oleksandr Usyk beating someone like that of a Fury, yeah, we have to give him a lot more credit for defeating someone like an H.A. Anthony Joshua or Tyson Fury, someone who was like 20 to 40 pounds bigger, if not even more. And on top of that, out-lengthened him by several inches in both height and reach. And Tyson Fury was looked at as like a top 10 level pound-for-pound fighter, debatably. We have to give Usyk a hell of a lot of credit for that because that's something that really should have never even been, possibly even achieved. But what Crawford was able to do against Gamboa, we've seen a lot of fighters do. Don't get it twisted. And I'm not claiming that it was not, an A-grade level win. It was, but to say that, that Crawford, that even though he was not the betting favorite to win that fight, and I do give Crawford a lot of credit for that Gamboa win, it's in 2020 hindsight. If Crawford is supposed to be up there with the all-time greats, then yes, he's supposed to beat Gamboa, especially because Gamboa is about two weight classes smaller than him. I mean, it is what it is. But anyway, but let's see. And let's actually address this idea that Crawford being bigger than Gamboa was some massive unfair advantage, because it really shows how little you understand about how size works in boxing. Crawford at 135 was a natural lightweight. He wasn't some bloated welterweight drilling down to make weight. He was a lean 135 pounder who happened to have a longer frame. Well, yes, that's very true. At the time, Crawford was more built for lightweight. Now, is he, ever going to stay there for a long time? No, because Crawford, and you can just tell with certain fighters when they're younger that they're eventually gonna have to move up. And you can even tell, you could even tell with certain fighters that were at 135 during this generation, like Teofimo Lopez, Ryan Garcia, or Devin Haney. Devin Haney would fight at 140 and balloon up, I believe, to like, well, what the hell did he balloon up to? I think he ballooned up to like 165, which is crazy. Like that's absolutely humongous. Like that's even, to be honest with you, that's even bigger than a natural welterweight. Devin Haney could probably even fit at 154 eventually if he really wanted to. But anyways, but yeah, Crawford was more of a natural lightweight. But the problem was is that Gamboa was not. Gamboa was not. Gamboa was never a natural lightweight. He was someone that was, really more of a natural featherweight, and that's really where he truly belonged. Probably 130 at an absolute maximum, but 135, no, he never belonged there. But anyway, let's see. Um, Having a reach advantage doesn't automatically translate into a boxing advantage unless you know how to use it. And plenty of longer fighters have been outboxed by shorter guys throughout history because reach alone doesn't fight for you. Well, that is very, very true. I mean, we have seen, a multitude of boxers that have a very, very long reach. So, of course, when it comes down to it, if you know how to box and if you have a great reach, of course, in order for that great reach to be, impressive, or in order for it to be a true advantage, yes, you have to know how to box. That is very, very clear. But when you have two boxers that truly know how to box, and you have that fighter that does have the clear size or the clear, reach advantage, it does create a great advantage. And that's why, someone can have a reach advantage like Mayweather. He had a reach advantage over most of his opponents, but at least it was somewhat comparable in some of his fights. And on top of that, Mayweather oftentimes would fight fighters that could have been 15, maybe even 20 pounds bigger than him at times. So I don't really mention it with Mayweather that much. But when you talk about certain guys like Oscar De La Hoya, when he's fighting guys like Arturo Gatti and, Julio Cesar Chavez and Pernell Whitaker and some of those other guys, and he's almost damn near 6 foot with about a 74 to 76 arm reach. Fighter that I mentioned oftentimes with has been that of Tommy Hearns. Tommy Hearns was someone overall that was built like a fucking super middleweight in terms of height and reach, and he still lost a lot of the bigger fights in the lower weight classes. That's why that win over Roberto Duran, I really do not count it. And I understand that certain people will say, well, what are you talking about? Why would you not count that? Because both Tommy Hearns and Roberto Duran were pound for pound level fighters. Now, if Tommy Hearns, of course, was someone that was more of a club fighter, someone that was a champion but not really that good, then, of course, it's a little bit different. So, yes, you have to be a great boxer in order to utilize it in the first place. But the point is that, when you have two pound for pound level boxers, if someone has like, and I'm not even just talking about like a 5-inch reach advantage, I'm talking about like a 9, to 10-inch reach advantage. Tommy Hearns, had a humongous reach advantage over Roberto Duran, and Crawford had a pretty big one over Yuriorkis Gamboa as well. So that's why I compared it like that, and I think that that's fair. I think that it's very fair. But anyway, and the reason why I don't really even count the Roberto Duran win that Tommy Hearns got, even though Duran was able to get the victory, I believe, over Leonard and, some of those other guys, is because Roberto Duran started off at 135, and he probably could have stayed there for his whole career. And the max weight class that he probably ever belonged at was at 147. Tommy Hearns at his max weight class probably, could have fought, at super middleweight. So, I mean, it is what it is. That's why, Tommy Hearns, although he is a great fighter, there's a reason why I never put him above the likes of Duran or Hagler or Leonard. Because the only huge, top 5 pound for pound win that he probably ever got was over Roberto Duran, who I don't think was top 5 pound for pound at that time, but it could be wrong. And on top of that, Duran was a whole lot smaller than him in terms of weight and in terms of reach. So, anyone who knows me knows I'm a sticker for that. But let's keep it going. Let's see. Gamboa's entire style was built on explosive athleticism, closing distance, and landing power shots on the inside. I agree. which is exactly the kind of style that neutralizes reach advantages when executed properly. Well, sometimes Gamboa, I think overall was someone that could really box. But he was, when you face a really great boxer like that of a Terrence Bud Crawford or a Floyd Mayweather, I mean, you can do that. But if you go in there with a lot of the faults that Gamboa had, you're eventually going to get, either a stopped or clearly outfought or outboxed. And Gamboa also had, a knack for getting knocked down, for keeping his hands down, for going in there a little bit too recklessly. After he got hit with certain exchanges or punches, he would always try to get right back at his opponents and not have patience. He would, be very, very, ecstatic, to kind of, get some of the shots inside the ring. And that ended up finally proving to be his downfall against Terrence Bud Crawford. So Gamboa, although he was a very talented fighter, I don't think that I can agree at this point that he just had the style that was perfect for countering Crawford's style. I think that he had some, moments to that, and he had some, ability. But just to argue that, I don't think I can agree with that, at least not to completion. Anyway, but let's see. All right, so let's continue here. Anyways, it says the reason Gamboa lost isn't because Crawford had longer arms. It's because Crawford was the better fighter with better timing, better ring IQ, and better shot selection. Well, although I do agree with all those points, I think we also have to probably state that the weight and the size and the reach definitely was, something that was very, very relevant. I mean, I think to just state something along the lines of, that it that it didn't have any uh, you know, impact, I guess is the word that I'm kind of looking for. To state that it basically wouldn't have any impact, I don't think that you can really state that. I think when you talk about the size advantage, where the fighter has a 9-inch reach advantage, and that fighter also never won a title at the two-weight classes above that he competed at after he won a title at 126. Obviously, Crawford is the better all-around fighter than Gamboa anyway. So I think that even had they been the same size, maybe at the time Gamboa would have beat Crawford if they would have been truly the same size like reach, because Gamboa was just very experienced in the amateurs, and he was someone that was a very good fighter at the time. But Crawford was he was a little bit more on the raw side in terms of still figuring out his skill set. But Crawford, of course, obviously once again he's someone that is an all-time greatly skilled fighter. So was the only reason why he won because of size? Obviously not. He's just an all-time great level fighter. But I don't think that we also can just sit here and pretend that Terrence Crawford did not have a 9-inch reach advantage and also did not have a few inches on him in terms of height, and also was clearly the bigger fighter. Because Gamboa, to be honest with you, never belonged at 135 in the first place. Now, is that me completely discrediting Crawford's A-grade level win? No, it's not. But, there's a reason why we do talk about weight classes and size advantages, and that was, a clear size advantage in that fight. But anyways, but let's continue. Let's see. Where are we at now? The reason, okay. If reach and size were automatic advantages, the Nikolai Valuev would have been the greatest heavyweight of all time, and Thomas Hearns would have never lost a fight. Well, although I tend to agree with you, the point is that, and this is the same thing. Many people, like I remember when I reviewed a video by Dante's Boxing Nation, and Usyk actually defeated that of a Tyson Fury. Dante was literally trying to compare that to when Evander Holyfield probably should have, beaten that of Nikolai Valuev, someone who was never really that talented. Now, Valuev was this big, Neanderthal looking Russian fighter, but he was never a very talented fighter. If you take a look at him in his fight against Evander Holyfield or some of his other fights, he was never an exceptionally gifted fighter. The fighters that I'm talking about are fighters that clearly are on a pound for pound level, but also fighters that, once again, that sometimes can be known as weight bullies. Now, I'm not going to claim that Crawford is a weight bully necessarily, but he definitely did have the size and reach over Gamboa. I'll definitely state that. And we've seen pound for pound fighters, even if they have been able to beat smaller fighters, once they finally get in the ring with bigger level competition that can actually handle their size and their reach, they don't look as great anymore. So that's why, once again, it took such a long time for me to acquiesce that Crawford was the true number one pound for pound fighter, because how do we know how great you are until you actually update your resume? Take a look at Oscar De La Hoya. Oscar was someone that beat the shit out of everyone when he was in the lower weight classes. He was undefeated for such a long time. Then he goes to welterweight and starts, going up to 154. And we start to see a lot of the holes in his game, whether it be against Felix Tito Trinidad or Fernando Vargas or Ike Corte, or some of those other guys, Floyd Mayweather. So there's, that always needs to be looked at. But anyway, but let's see. And Thomas Hearns, overall was a great fighter. But Thomas Hearns, he's also one of the more overrated fighters of all time. And, part of the reason why is because he lost so many damn fights, even though he was very clearly at a minimum a middleweight fighter. Thomas Hearns, once again, he had that great win over Duran, and he did have other wins like Wilfredo Benitez and other wins like that. But Thomas Hearns, in a lot of his big championship level fights, lost. That's why I could never have Thomas Hearns in my top 20 ever. You can never debate that Thomas Hearns is in that conversation as the greatest fighter of all time. How? He lost to Hagler, he lost to Leonard. The only big, huge win in terms of all time great conversations that he really got was that over Roberto Duran. Now, of course, is that the only great win that he got? No. He did also beat Wilfredo Benitez and some of the other guys. But in terms of that Four King era, he only beat Duran. And for the size and talent and speed and power that he had, he should have done a lot more, with the skills that he had. That's why Thomas Hearns is not up higher for me. Anyways, but let's see. You're harping on the size difference is just or you harping on the size difference is just another way of avoiding the obvious conclusion that Crawford was simply superior. I do agree that he was superior, and it's the same lazy analysis that people use when they don't want to give a fighter credit for a dominant performance. I would mainly agree, but once again, that's the reason why I did that video was to respond, to someone else's logic anyway. Crawford was a 26-year-old fighting a former pound-for-pound ranked fighter who was the favorite. The fact that you're acting like this win needs an asterisk is comedy. Usyk's early title wins at cruiserweight were against fighters with, I guess I don't continue. But anyways, that being stated, overall, I agree, with some of these guys' points. I don't agree with, all of them, but, we'll talk about that, but anyways, let's continue on here. All right, so once again, let's continue. So of course, this is gonna we're against fighters with comparable or lesser names value than Gamboa had at the time. Well, that's probably somewhat true, but once again, the fact that Gamboa was probably about two weight classes smaller, it's going to even it out a lot more. Anyways, Glavaki's best win was a faded Marco Huck, and you yourself admitted Huck might only be B plus level. That is true, but Glavaki also was someone that was a legit, A grade level boxer in my view. Now, we don't have to state that he was necessarily quite as talented as Gamboa, but one thing that we can state is that he was undefeated. He beat, and I'm not gonna claim that Huck was, completely faded. I just don't ever know if Huck was really, a complete A grade level fighter to begin with. But it's a debate, it is a debate. You could debate that Huck is up there. And that was when Huck was ranked number one in the division. And Glavaki literally beat the shit out of that man. And Usyk ended up completely, embarrassing Glavaki. Now, one could debate that Usyk had a slight size advantage against some of those cruiserweights, maybe to a degree, but their weights, were very comparable. And their sizes also are very comparable as well. But anyway, so let's continue. So Glavaki beat a B plus fighter, and that makes him A minus grade. But Gamboa, a former unified champion and Olympic gold medalist, gets discounted because he was shorter. Make it make sense. Well, once again, Glavaki and Usyk, they were both undefeated. And Glavaki, you could maybe say that he's not quite on the level of Gamboa if you want to, but he was someone that, I would at least claim is on the same level as a Victor Postol, just in my personal view. That's what I would state there. But anyways, let's continue. You tried to diminish Postol by saying his only great win was Matisse. Then you diminished Matisse by saying he got outboxed by Danny Garcia. Danny Garcia was a unified champion and a generally elite fighter. Losing to Danny Garcia is not an indictment of your career. Well, no, it's not. Danny Garcia was a relatively great fighter. He was a two-way division champion. That being stated, Danny Garcia also lost to Keith Thurman quite clearly. He also lost to Sean Porter, and he also lost dominantly to Errol Spence. So Danny Garcia, although he is a relatively great fighter, he's not someone that I don't think people would take a look at and say, he's top 5 pound for pound. At one time, maybe when he was at 140, when he was beating guys like Batiste and Amir Khan and some other guys like that. But after that, after he ended up losing, at 147. I think a lot of the aura started to, get off Danny Garcia, and I think it was obvious that he was beatable. But anyways, let's see. Losing to Danny Garcia is not an okay. We already read that. By that standard, losing to Crawford should also count as evidence of quality, not weakness. Postal was undefeated, big for the weight. I agree with that. And had just dismantled one of the most feared punchers in boxing. Crawford went to his backyard and unified on him. That's an elite win, regardless of how many of Postal's other opponents you don't know personally. You don't personally recognize on Wikipedia. Well, the thing is about Postal is that I know some of the names on his resume, but they're not really what you would call elite. Demarcus Chop Chop Collier, once again, was completely washed by the time the Postal had fought him. And of course, you also have, what was his name? Solden or whatever Cold Kick Sut, whatever his name is. I forget his name, the Turkish fighter that he fought. But there's no other A grade level names on there other than Matisse. I mean, I don't see any. But anyway. You kept asking where the A grade names were at 140 as if Crawford was ducking people. Well, no, I didn't say that Crawford was ducking people. It's just that he was not a part of the strongest weight class. That's all I meant. But anyway, he literally unified the entire division. He beat every single champion available at 140. There was nobody left. That's not a criticism of Crawford. That's a criticism of the division's depth, which Crawford had zero control over. Well, I agree, which is exactly what, I stated. I never thought that the division was that deep by the time Crawford had got there. By that time Amir Khan had left, Danny Garcia had left, Rustam Ivanikov and, what's his name? Lucas Matisse. There were still forces, but they were a bit older. So I mean, it is what it is. Anyways. All right, so let's continue to the part where they talk about Lomachenko because, of course, Lomachenko, there was many debates about whether Lomachenko should have ever been the number one pound for pound fighter. In my view, yes, he should have been at least for a short time. But let's get into it. Lomachenko, who you praised for being pound for pound number one with guys like Gary Russell Jr. on his resume, was operating in similarly thin divisions. Russell had one title defense at that point. Walters quit on his stool, but those count as A grade wins, while Crawford cleaning out 140 doesn't. Well, the way that both Gary Russell and also Walters were looked at, whether they be a little bit in the future or at that moment in time, they were looked at as way differently and also very much similar in size to Lomachenko compared to what Gamboa was, compared to that of a Crawford. So, that's a little bit different. But Gary Russell Jr. was looked at as an A grade level fighter, especially in terms of talent. Now in terms of talent, was Gamboa better than some of those guys? Maybe, who knows? But Nicholas Walters was also another big name, and he was looked at as the number one guy of that said weight class. So that's why that was, looked at as a little bit different. Now, Postal, of course, was looked at as a very decent fighter, but I don't think anyone ever took a look at Postal and thought that he was, the best of any respective weight class. Where Lomachenko was running through guys like Gary Russell and Nicholas Walters, guys that actually were looked at as, legitly talented and, potentially the best of their weight class. But anyway, I mean, Postal, of course, had that win over Matisse and became one of the best in his weight class. But I don't think anyone ever expected, Postal to, be the gold standard of boxing. But anyway, let's see. The bias is generally embarrassing. Porter lost to Keith Thurman in a fight. Many people scored for Porter. Well, it was a close fight, but I thought that Thurman won about 7-5, but it was very close. He lost to Spence in a fight that was competitive until the late rounds. I agree with that. He lost a debatable decision to Kell Brook. I don't think it was really that debatable. I thought that, Porter clearly lost that, but I'd have to rewatch it to be fair. It's been many years. Those are losses to elite fighters in close fights. I agree, which is evidence that Porter was elite, not evidence that he was washed. Well, and although I do agree with that, because Porter was, once again, at the time, at a very good point. Once again, that was a response to the logic of Hitman. Because he claimed all this stuff about, Tyson Fury being washed up and AJ being washed up, although he lost to Ruiz, blah, blah, blah. Right, but Sean Porter was a guy who lost to Thurman and, all those guys. Basically lost every big fight in his career against the true number one contenders or top three contenders, and they never mention it. And on top of that, Porter was no longer a title holder. So my point is this. If you're going to criticize, those people for that, no problem, but keep the same standards. Anyways. So let's see. A fighter who is only losing razor thin decisions to the best welterweights on earth is by definition still top tier welterweight. I agree with that, which is why once again, when we talk about the resume of Usyk, when people try to say that Tyson Fury was washed up, now to be fair, he did almost lose to an MMA fighter, but I don't think he took that fight seriously whatsoever. And he had people tried to say that Fury wasn't shit. No, Fury had dominated Wilder, Vladimir Klitschko, and Dillian White. Fury was a force to be reckoned with. People, of course, will talk about AJ, being robotic, and, he was a bit robotic in his movement, but he still had a great resume. He beat Kubrat Pulev in probably the most, impressive performance of his career. Now, Pulev was not really an A-grade level fighter, in my view, but he was someone that was, a top 15 to top 10 contender at one point in time, and AJ pretty much made him look foolish. And then on top of that, that's not even including the wins over guys like Joseph Parker, Dillian White, and older Vladimir Klitschko, but is still very game Vladimir Klitschko. He gave AJ a very tough fight, damn near knocked him out, and other fights as well. Alexander Mavyakin. Anyways, so let's see. Um, Porter retired after Crawford because Crawford broke him, not because he was already broken. Well, I don't think that Porter was necessarily at the top, of it mentally. But he still was, in my view, around at his best. Maybe not at his absolute peak, but around at his best. So technically, I do agree with that. He was still a live dog in every fight he took. Your own definition of washed was a fighter who could never compete for a title again. Porter was literally a title challenger in the Crawford fight. You contradicted yourself within the same video. You said you're not going to claim the car accident affected Spence, and then immediately listed the car accident as a factor. Pick one, Spence was the betting favorite going into the Crawford fight. Yeah, and we'll get into that here in this next part. But anyways, yes, technically I do agree with this man. I don't think that they're viable enough excuses either. I'm just saying that, once again, you gotta, keep the same standards if you're gonna do that for one fighter. But I also agree, Porter, in my view, he was on his last legs, but he was someone that, still was at a good point in his career. He gave Crawford a very competitive fight, and I think that that's evidence enough that, Crawford fought a Porter that still was at a very good point. Maybe not at the best point in his career, but still someone who was about an A-minus level fighter. So I give him a lot of credit for that. Anyways. Okay, so continuing on here, and once again, I agree with the Porter point. Porter was no longer a title holder, if you want to claim that. All I'm saying is that if you're going to make excuses with the Fury and AJ Anthony Joshua thing, then you definitely have to do that for Porter and Gamboa and, some of those other guys. But anyways, let's see. So it says he was ranked top 5 pound for pound by every major outlet. I agree. Talking about Spence, he chose to take the fight. If Spence was diminished, that's on every analyst and better in the sport for not saying it. Not on Crawford for accepting the fight everyone demanded he'd take. And the 14-month layoff point. Fury was also inactive between fights multiple times. Came back out of a 2-year retirement fueled by substance abuse. And you're crediting Usyk fully for beating him. Well, here's overall the thing. When people talk about the dopamine thing, or the dopamine, excuse me, when they talk about the doping with Tyson Fury or with him, having a dope addiction or whatever they want to call it. Point overall is that Tyson Fury, I believe that he did, but then he came back out of retirement and he was pretty consistently active. Now, not always as active as what he could have been, but once he got back in the ring, I think around 2000, 18, 19, I don't know what year it was, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. Tyson Fury pretty much stayed in the ring consistently. And he had 3 fights with Deontay Wilder. He had a fight with Dillian White. And he also had a trilogy fight with Derek Chisora, and he was able to embarrass all of them. So that's that's why the point is that Crawford fought Spence directly off a 14th month layoff. Now that being stated, do I think that that's enough an excuse to why Spence lost the fight? No. Do I still think that he was a top 5 level pound for pound fighter? Yes, personally I do. But anyways, but let's see. Once again, that was pretty much just to keep the same standards. But let's see. The double standard is almost impressive in how blatant it is. And let's actually talk about what the car accident supposedly did to Spence, since you want to mumble about it without committing to a position. Spence came back from that accident and knocked out Danny Garcia, a former unified champion, in dominant fashion. Well, actually, no, he did not knock him out. In fact, he didn't even knock him down. A lot of people actually thought that Spence overall, that he did not have the most impressive performance in that fight. I thought that for a comeback performance, especially against the likes of Danny Garcia, that it was very impressive. And that's why the car accident argument for me doesn't really hold a lot of weight. Because, Errol Spence came back and in his performance previously, although maybe he didn't look quite the same against Danny, he had one of the best performances he's ever had against Yordenis Ugas, who was recently coming off of a victory over, pretty much almost a very near to done Manny Pacquiao, but still, Yordenis Ugas was a very good fighter. And Errol Spence pretty much made him look like a toddler in there in terms of boxing ability. And it was one of his most impressive performances in years, which was why Errol Spence would return and become the betting favorite over Crawford. So I agree, but anyway. Then he went and beat Ugas, another world champion, stopped him in the later rounds and looked sharp doing it. I agree. So Spence had two post-accident wins over legitimate world-class opposition, where he looks like a fully functional elite welterweight. And you're going to sit here and tell people the accident diminished him. I agree with that point. Anyway, um, let's see. Based on what exactly? Because Crawford made him look bad. That's not evidence of decline. That's evidence of Crawford being better. It depends on what you want to take a look at. Personally, I also agree. I don't think that Spence showed enough for me to just, completely blame the car wrecks. I think that Spence, was someone that maybe had a little bit more wear and tear, but I think he was still, a debatable top 5 pound for pound fighter. But anyway, let's see. The entire sports odds makers, analysts, former fighters looked at Spence's post-accident performances and collectively decided he was still elite enough to be favored in the biggest welterweight fight of the generation. But you random YouTube analysts scrolling through BoxRec on camera, you figured out something the entire boxing world missed. The arrogance of that position is generally staggering. If the car accident had truly diminished Spence, he wouldn't have been able to walk down and stop Yordenis Ugas, a slick Cuban stylist who gave Pacquiao problems. I would technically agree with that. Once again, that's the point that I've been making, for a while. Although a lot of people may not realize that. Well, what I will say about Yordenis Ugas is this: Ugas is a very good fighter, maybe an A-minus level fighter, but I'm not gonna sit here and claim that Ugas is someone like a Lara or a a Rigondeaux. So let's let's not go that far. I don't think that he's trying to go that far. I'm just saying that let's talk about that because it's not like Ugas did not have several losses. But anyway. I mean, of course, he kind of hit his peak a little bit later on, but still, Ugas was someone that was very good, but I don't know if he was ever truly great. Just my view. He wouldn't have been able to jab and outwork Danny Garcia for 12 clean rounds. I agree. Those performances exist on film, and you can watch them anytime you want, but you won't because it's a lot easier to mumble car accident and move on than it is to actually reconcile the evidence that contradicts your narrative. Canelo at 35 is still Canelo, the man who had just beaten Berlanga and was still a unified super middleweight champion and was considered a significant betting favorite in many projections before Crawford moved up and went to challenge him. Well, by the time that Crawford actually went up to face Canelo, I believe that Canelo was only a 2-1 favorite. I think that had this been about 3 to 4 years ago, then Canelo probably would have been more like a 3 to 4 to 1 favorite. But it was very obvious that Canelo was slowing down. And that's, Canelo was a lot more slow than what Errol Spence was, in my personal view. Errol Spence, was someone that at the very least was at a decent age. I'm not going to claim that either man was in their absolute peak of their prime, but, they were pretty darn close to it. But it's been very obvious at Canelo that he's been sliding downhill for the past few years. In the Jaime Munguia fight and the Edgar Berlanga fight, the older Canelo probably would have been able to knock those guys out. But anyway, and I'm not claiming that Crawford still does not deserve a great amount of credit because at the end of the day, he was not in peak form either. He was 38. He was someone that was moving up a couple of weight classes, so he deserves credit. But anyway, let's see. Crawford went up 2 weight classes to fight the most commercially powerful boxer of the generation. You framing this as Crawford catching a faded Canelo is the same logic people use against literally every great win in boxing history. Leonard beat a faded Hagler. I agree, which is why I compare that a lot. I always state that. Mayweather beat a past prime Pacquiao. I agree. At a certain point, elite fighters are in their 30s when they fight each other because that's how career timelines work. I agree. Now, of course, that being stated, there are certain fighters that do not age well at a certain point compared to other fighters. Like when you talk about certain fighters, Victor Ortiz, for example, at 37 years old, he was washed. But you have other fighters that are in their 40s and they're still in a relative prime state, like what Bernard Hopkins was. Anyways, but let's continue, or to better be. Crawford went up to 168 and took the fight. That's what you wanted him to do, and now you're penalizing him for it. And since you clearly need this spelled out, Canelo at 35 is a technically superior fighter to Canelo at 28. And if you actually watched his fights instead of scoring Wikipedia pages, you know that Canelo in his 20s was a flat-footed counterpuncher who struggled with movers. That's really why Mayweather made him look like an amateur, and why Araceli Lara and also Chad gave him ugly nights. Um, well, to talk about that very quickly, Canelo was definitely smarter as a fighter at this point, I think, than what he was against Mayweather. I don't think there's any doubt about that. However, Canelo, as an all around physical fighter, and even as a skilled fighter, he was not quite the same fighter that he was even just 4 years ago. Like the last great performance that I had seen in Canelo probably was against Caleb Plant, which is why he was not able to stop a lot of those opponents. To be honest with you, actually, I don't even know if he's been able to stop one opponent ever since he stopped Caleb Plant. So Canelo Alvarez, he's a great fighter, but would I claim that Canelo was greater here at 35 than when he was at 28? No. I think that you can claim that he was greater here than when he was very much younger. But to say that he was greater in this fight than when he was at 28, I don't know if I can agree with that. But, anyways, the Canelo that showed up, let me also state this. It's so interesting because, these guys, they always state that Canelo Alvarez, that he didn't improve whatsoever and that he's been massively overrated. That's what guys like Dante will tell you. But now that Crawford beat Canelo, all of a sudden he's the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. All of a sudden, Canelo Alvarez is even better than what he was before. So that goes to show you once again how easily they change their narrative depending on who wins. But let's continue. The Canelo that showed up in the last few years has an entirely rebuilt defensive system. I somewhat agree. Improved head movement and better punch selection, tighter combinations off the back foot, and a jab he basically didn't even throw 10 years ago. I agree with that, but Canelo also is a lot slower than what he used to be. And that was shown in the Williams Skull fight. Canelo Alvarez was he was severely slowed in that Williams Skull fight. But anyway, but once again, Crawford was not at his peak either. That to me was very comparable to a Sugar Ray Leonard versus Marvin Hagler type of fight, to where a lot of people say that one fighter was faded, but you still have to give Crawford a great amount of credit for that. His win over Berlanga showed sharper combination work than almost anything from his Golovkin era. Um, I don't know. I'm not going to claim that. I think that Canelo, that his second fight against Golovkin was one of his top peak performances. I can't go that far. Sorry. I can claim that Canelo was better here than maybe what he was very much younger, but to claim that Canelo looked better here, in recent fights than what he did in, say, like his Golovkin fights, especially the rematch, no, I'm sorry. I can't agree with that. But anyway. His body attack has gotten more surgical, not less. The idea that Canelo is slowing down because he's 35 is the most casual surface level observation imaginable. The man's timing and counter ability have actually sharpened because he spent 2 decades in a professional ring learning when to throw and when not to, which is part of boxing that improves with experience rather than declines with age. Well, you know, of course, his experience and his level of IQ definitely did improve. But the problem is that when you start slowing down as a fighter, some of your attacks, have to change around a little bit. You're slower. You can't get to the punch, or you can't get to your target quite as quick. You might become more hittable. And it was obvious that, all those things, in my view, that they've been present in Canelo Alvarez for the past few years. And once again, that's not me discrediting Crawford, because Crawford has clearly slowed down a little bit as well. So Crawford won that fight because he was all around the more skilled fighter. Do I think that Canelo was at an absolute peak form? No, I do not. But he still was a top 10 level pound for pound fighter. So that is a win that Crawford deserves credit for, and he'll deserve, forever. But anyways, so let's see. Guys like Bernard Hopkins were better at 40 than 30 for the same reason. Yes, I agree. There are certain guys that are better at 40 years old than what they were at 30. Hopkins is one of those few fighters, which is why I always say that Hopkins, when he was facing guys like Calzaghe, Jermaine Taylor, he was around his prime. And a lot of people, disagree with me. However, neither Crawford or Canelo very clearly were at their prime. You could tell that they had started to slow down a little bit as fighters, especially Canelo. But anyway, Canelo's power hasn't diminished. His chin is still intact. He's still a unified champion. And every single betting line and analyst consensus going into the Crawford fight reflected a fighter who is still considered elite, not some charity case being wheeled out for a retirement beating. Well, I agree with that. He wasn't a charity case, wheeled out for a retirement beating. But there was a lot of people picking Crawford in this fight, especially because they thought that Canelo had slowed down. And there were articles for years, stating that Canelo had not looked the same, whether it was against Bivol, whether against Golovkin in the trilogy, whether against Perlanga or Munguia. There were inklings all over the place that Canelo was not quite the same fighter. Anyways, but let's see. Um, where does it go? Your own breakdown gave Usyk 6 confirmed A-grade wins. You gave Crawford 6. Uh, I think you could debatably give Usyk more, but it's up to you. You then spent the rest of the video acting like Usyk 6 were dramatically superior. Let's actually compare the top end wins. Anyways, let's continue. Crawford beat Spence, who was a consensus top 5 pound for pound fighter. Crawford beat Canelo, the face of boxing, in his own weight class. Usyk's two biggest wins are over Fury and Joshua, both outstanding wins generally, but Joshua had already been knocked out by Andy Ruiz and looked diminished in several fights before Usyk got to him. Um, well, actually, no, that's not true. Joshua did not look diminished before Oleksandr Usyk got to him. In fact, that's not even possible because several fights before then, AJ Anthony Joshua, if it would have been several fights before then, that would have been even before the Andrew Ruiz loss. So it doesn't really make any sense. But to talk about AJ Anthony Joshua, no, he wasn't diminished. And actually, AJ was, superior because of that Andrew Ruiz loss. He ended up actually growing a little bit as a fighter, and he had one of the best performances in his career over Kubrat Pulev. But, to talk about the comparison with Canelo, for example, Canelo Alvarez, for example, it was very clear that he was slowed down in that fight. I'm not claiming that he was still not a great fighter, but he was no longer anywhere near the peak of his powers. Anyways, so let's see. Fury came in heavy and had been inactive and had the Ngannou performance on his recent record. If you're going to play were they really at their best game with Crawford's opponents, you have to play with Usyk's too, and you clearly don't want to because it would undermine the entire thesis. Well, I agree. Once again, that's that was the whole point of this video. Once again, was to go by a different type of logic. Anyway, but yeah. And here's the thing that really exposes how flawed your framework is when you compare Usyk's cruiserweight opponents to Crawford's opponents across 135, 140, and 147. Every single elite or world champion level opponent Crawford faced was a better pure boxer than the cruiserweight guys Usyk was beating. Well, I don't think I can agree with that. When you talk about, maybe guys like, even if you want to go as far to gamble on post style, I mean, you can claim that, but guys like Ricky Burns or Raimundo Beltran or certain guys like that, no. I'm sorry, but no. Usyk was beating Glavacki, Breedis, Gatsiev, Hunter. Those are solid fighters relative to the cruiserweight division, but the cruiserweight division has historically limited depth and talent compared to the welterweight and super middleweight divisions Crawford was operating in. Well, yes, that's very true, but just because overall, once again, a division is historically known for being superior in most regards doesn't mean that it's always the case. And at 135, it pretty much was emptied out with all the real talent like Danny Garcia and a prime Amir Khan, or excuse me, at 140 and at 135. I mean, it's not like that was the era where Vasily Lomachenko, Devin Haney, and Teofimo Lopez were in the weight classes. He beat Ricky Burns, Gamboa, and Raimundo Beltran, and that's, it's very good, but it's not like, most of those wins are A grade. Anyway, but let's see. Um, you're grading those guys as A level because they were the best in their division, but being the best in a shallow division doesn't make you equivalent to the best in a stacked one. And I agree with that. But the cruiserweight division actually at the time was stacked. Because you had the undefeated Maris Bradis, you had the undefeated Junior Dorticos, you had the undefeated Glavacki, you had Tony Bellew in that weight class, David Hayes still a little bit. You had so many fighters there, that were actually just filled with talent. There was a lot of fighters there. Michael Hunter, that actually was probably the best the cruiserweight division had ever been, and Usyk ran through them. Murat Gassiev, so I think I'm a lot of credit there. Anyway, you're grading these guys. Okay, I think we already read that. A Sean Porter, Errol Spence, and Canelo Alvarez, these are fighters who would be elite in any era at any weight, operating in divisions with genuine depth where there are multiple killers at every level. Comparing them pound for pound to cruiserweight champions whose claim the A-grade status is beating other cruiserweights in a division that barely has 10 legitimate contenders at any given time is not a logical analysis. It's just artificially inflating one's resume while holding the other to a higher standard. Why someone agree with that? That being stated, is Sean Porter someone that I believe would be this monster within a multitude of weight divisions? I could see him at most becoming a two-weight division champion. Would I ever see him being someone that, would be this killer? No. He's just too flawed, which is why he lost a lot of the bigger fights. Would I see Victor Postol being that guy? No, I would not. Would I see Israel Madrimov being that guy? No, I would not. Now, Canelo and Spence, maybe Gamboa, I think that you can kind of claim that. And then with Tyson Fury and AJ, it's kind of hard to define. But you can debate that guys like Murat Gassiev and Bradis and certain guys like that, for example, if they were to fight at light heavyweight, that they could have been champions there, or other guys like that. So Glavacki as well. There were some real talented guys at cruiserweight that you did not want to mess with there because they were talented. But anyways, let's see. Let's see. Um, let's see. Boxers regardless. Okay. Crawford's list of elite wins is fighting objectively more skilled, more proven, more accomplished opposition than what Usyk faced at the cruiserweight. Well, you can debate that, I think, with guys like Spence and Canelo. I'm not really quite sure if you can debate that with guys like Postal and the other names that he fought, like Ndongo and some of those guys. I can't agree with that. Would I claim that guys like Ndongo or Burns or Beltran or Delorme or those guys or Jeff Horn, that those guys are more skilled than the cruiserweights that Usyk fought? No, absolutely not. But anyway. That's not to disrespect Usyk. His heavyweight wins over Fury and Joshua are phenomenal, but padding the A grade count with cruiserweight names to make it look like he has a deeper resume than Crawford is intellectually dishonest when the quality of opposition at the top end clearly favors Crawford. Well, I agree that, you can debate that Crawford has fought more pound for pound level fighters. But in terms of, the early part of the career, would I agree that Crawford had fought more A grade level names? No, personally, I would not. Not until he got to welterweight and would have that 4-win streak over Porter, Madrimov, what was Spence and Canelo. But anyway, let's see. This was the weakest part of the entire video, and you seem to know it, which is probably why you rushed through the Inoue section. You gave Inoue credit for Fulton, Donaire, Tapales, and MJ Akhmadaliev, while admitting multiple times that some of those are debatable. Absolutely. Fulton is a genuine A-grade win. Donaire was 39 years old. Agreed. Tapales, you had to argue into A- territory by signing his win over Akhmadaliev, who you then also listed as a separate A-grade win. So you're using circular logic to inflate two wins simultaneously. Neri was a career 118-pounder fighting at 122 with his own list of issues. You tried to say Inoue's resume at 32 is comparable to Crawford's, but Crawford at 32 had already unified at 140 and was a welterweight champion. Inoue at 32 is operating in the thinnest pool in boxing. Well, the problem is that Crawford was not really operating in the thickest pool either. I understand that he did have wins over Ricky Burns and guys like that, and don't get it twisted. If you were to debate that some of the wins that Inoue has right there, that they're not A grade, I think of course you can debate that. The problem was with Crawford and Inoue. Don't get it twisted. He was in some pretty thin divisions as well. Like I don't think that his run at 118 was really just this phenomenal run of great fighters. But when you talk about Inoue overall, once again, you know, he does have to get bigger names. But when you talk about Crawford, once again, he didn't have the greatest run of big names either, because there wasn't really, other than Victor Postol, really any other big names at 140. And I'm not quite sure Postol ever would have been on the level of someone like even an Amir Khan or a Danny Garcia. So that's why we kind of have to talk about that. And at 135, other than Gamboa, I mean, did he really beat anyone that we would consider A grade? Not really. He beat Ricky Burns and he beat Beltran. Those are two good wins, but they're not A grade. I think that Gamboa was an A grade level win, but he also was decently sized over Gamboa. But anyway, let's see. Lower than what Crawford or Usyk faced. And I agree with that. Inoue is phenomenal, but propping his resume up as comparable to Crawford's requires you to grade an enormous curve that you refuse to acknowledge. Your entire method is look at the opponent's Wikipedia pages and count how many names you recognize. That's not analysis. That's surface level pattern matching dressed up as criticism. Well, you know, once again, for those of you that recognize the names, we pretty much, for those of us that know both the career of Inoue and also that of what's his name, a Crawford, we pretty much know, a lot of the names that they ended up fighting, at least for those of us that have paid close attention. Now, am I claiming that Inoue has fought the most amount of A grade level names? No. but their resumes are very, very comparable, for their, times and age. Now if we're comparing it all time, is Inoue's resume comparable to Crawford's? No. But, at the, time of being about 32 years old, yes, it is somewhat comparable. Anyways, let's see. You don't account for the context of when fights happened, what was at stake, how dominant the performances were, or what the consensus view was at the time those fights were made. And yes, those are very important, to talk about. I agree. You need context. Crawford's knockout of Spence was one of the most dominant performances in modern boxing. His win over Canelo was a masterclass in the ring, generalship against a boxer and a bigger man. Those performances matter when you are evaluating a resume. I agree. Well, you just brought up the bigger man point, sir, but you just argued earlier that, that's not something that you can argue, if you want to keep the same standards. So even you yourself must know that fighting a bigger man obviously gets you more credit. But anyway, those performances matter when evaluating a resume, and you ignore all of them because they don't fit into your spreadsheet approach of counting names on a Wikipedia page. You said multiple times, if we're going to keep the same standards, let's be consistent. You were not consistent for a single minute of this video. Well, no, it wasn't really meant to be consistent in the way that you thought it was going to be. But anyway, you held Crawford to the strictest possible standard on every opponent while giving Usyk and Inoue the benefit of the doubt at every turn. That's not objectivity. That's a conclusion looking for evidence. Well, the thing overall is, because I understand what he's trying to say. When you talk about Oleksandr Usyk, when you talk about him fighting Glavaki, it depends on what your standards, are for A-grade level fighters. But Glavaki, and some of those other guys, Glavaki, Morris Bradis, and some of those other guys at cruiserweight, they were legit A-grade level fighters, because if you would have put those guys, at the super middleweight division, or say, at the light heavyweight division, they, in my view, also would have been fighters that could have shown a lot of talent and a lot of promise there. But it was just never going to happen because the cruiserweight fighters are in a very precarious situation. They basically have to stay at cruiserweight because light heavyweight is way too low. They can't go down there, and they oftentimes can't go up to heavyweight because, the fighters there are way too big, especially in this type of era with the super heavyweights. So my point being is that, it depends. But when you also take a look at the context, if we're going to talk about the context, Inoue versus that of Donaire, yes, Donaire, to be fair, was looked at as a guy that was nowhere near the same. So I think that does have to be talked about. MJ Akhmadaliev was looked at as a guy that was a true A-grade level fighter before his loss to DePalas, and that fight was looked at as one of the biggest fights in boxing, Inoue versus Akhmadaliev. And DePalas was looked at as a fighter that also was legit as well, because he had just recently beat MJ Akhmadaliev, and he also, and of course, you also have to go off of talent as well. And DePalas actually showed a decent amount of talent. And when we talk about, DePalas, for example, DePalas, in my view, would probably be better than guys like Julius Ndongo and some of the other guys that Crawford fought at 135 or 140. Not all of them, of course. I don't think that he would be better than Gamboa, but I think that he would be around the same level as a Post style, in my view, at least in terms of talent. But anyway, but let's see. And I think he has one other thing. All right. Anyway, let's see. Whew, anyway. And this whole argument about how Crawford wasn't really the consensus number one pound for pound fighter for most of his career is one of the most disingenuous points of your entire video, because you're conflating consensus number one with deserving of being in the conversation. It depends on who you ask. There's a reason why I bring that up. Nobody with a brain is claiming Crawford was the locked in undisputed number one pound for pound fighter in 2015 when he was still at 135. Well, there are certain people overall that would, sir. Like, you have guys like Dante's Boxing Nation and some of these other guys that claim that Terence Bud Crawford hasn't been the number one pound for pound for the past 8 years or so, and there's just no possible way. So that's the reason why I bring it up, because there are a lot of people out there that believe the narrative that Crawford, the reason why he wasn't number one was because he was just blackballed. No sort of bullshit. There was no blackballed about it. To be honest with you, Terence Bud Crawford, kind of like Inoue right now, he probably was in the top 5 pound for pound a little bit earlier than what he probably deserved to be. But anyways, let's see. The argument is that Crawford has been a top 5 pound for pound fighter for the better part of a decade and became the clear number one after the Spence win, which is exactly what happened. No problem with that point whatsoever, and I completely agree. Here's the problem. There are many people out there that believe that Crawford was the number one pound for pound fighter even before the Spence win. And that not only was he the number one pound for pound fighter, but that he was the consensus and that he should have been the lock for it. Even and these same people were criticizing resumes like that of Usyk's or Lomachenko's or Canelo's when they basically all had better resumes than Canelo at least at a certain time, or excuse me, better resumes than Crawford at a certain time. So so this person believes that, well, no one's arguing that Crawford was number one at this point. Actually, that's not true. There are many of these channels that will try to debate with you that Crawford was number one, once he was at 140. Anyways, but let's see. But here's what's actually funny about your point. You're acting like the pound for pound rankings at any given time are some objective truth handed down to God, when in reality they've always been influenced by politics. Well, I agree with that. Promotional backing, television deals, and narrative. I agree with that, but we also can decipher by ourselves, who is deserving, in the pound for pound conversation. By logic, and on top of that, taking a look at who they have fought and the context of things. Anyways, let's see. Lomachenko was ranked number one pound for pound with wins over Gary Russell Jr., who had one title defense, right? But he also would become a fighter that was, held in very high esteem. Either way, he was looked at as an A grade level fighter. But anyways, who had one title defense? Nicholas Walters, who literally quit on his stool. Yes, he did, but he also was a guy who knocked out Nonito Donaire when he moved up. And on top of that, was looked at as the best of his weight class and a legit A grade level fighter. And Gilbert Rigondeaux, who moved up 2 weight classes on short notice and was completely undersized. Well, once again, I agree with that, sir. But once again, that would be the same standard that we would have to hold Crawford to. I also agree that Lomachenko that he fought at Gilbert Rigondeaux that was about a weight class and a half, undersized. So that definitely does have to pop up there. But anyways, if that resume qualifies someone for number one pound for pound, then Crawford at 140 as a three-belt unified champion absolutely belonged in that same conversation. And the only reason he wasn't ranked there by certain outlets is because he was on ESPN with Top Rank getting zero promotional push, while Canelo had his own money and Lomachenko had the media machine behind him. Well, there's a slight bit of that. But there's also a part of it because Crawford was just not fighting enough A grade level fighters. Lomachenko, by the time he was like 12-1, already had wins over guys like Linares, Gary Russell, Nicholas Walters, and Guillermo Rigondeaux. That's what the problem was. Crawford kept fighting guys like, Felix Diaz and Aegis Kavalaskas and Jeff Horn for a long time. And you're not going to get updated on the pound for pound list fighting those guys. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. Anyways, you're treating the rankings as if they are some neutral reflection of ability when they've never been that. Crawford unified at 140, moved to 147, became champion there, and then starts the consensus number one wants win in the world. I agree with that. But keep in mind that Lomachenko did the same thing to the consensus best, of Guillermo Rigondeaux, Nicholas Walters, who were looked at as the best of their weight classes. And that's not even talking about Jorge Linares. But anyway, let's see. The fact that certain lists didn't have him at number one before, that says more about the list than it does about Crawford. Well, I don't agree with that. Crawford, once again, is a great fighter. But you cannot be number one pound for pound when guys like Canelo and Lomachenko, when Canelo's beating guys like Kovalev and Golovkin and Danny Jacobs, and already has guys like Lauren and Austin trying to just resume, and Lomachenko has, Rigondeaux, Walters, and Gary Russell Jr. on his resume, who are all looked at as A-grade level fighters. And Crawford's best wins are Victor Postol, who, to be honest with you, people did not really know whether he was a 100% A-grade level fighter or not. And Gamboa, someone who was, about 2 weight classes smaller. That was the problem. But anyway, let's continue. And beyond all that, the pound for pound ranking and any snapshot in time is irrelevant to the overall resume discussion anyway. You don't evaluate a career by checking what number a guy was ranked in 2016. Well, no, you don't completely rank it. I agree with that, but it can at least, be a little bit of a decipher. You can, at least talk about who is on the quote unquote pound for pound list. So, that does have to be mentioned right there. And even you yourself admitted that, Crawford beating Spence, and also that of a Canelo Alvarez, that is a part of the reason of what makes Crawford's resume great, even possibly over Usyk. So we do have to take a look to a degree of who is at least counted in a high level of esteem. Now, just because a fighter is not counted in a high level of esteem, does that necessarily mean that they're not a great fighter? No, of course not. Marlon DePalis, of course, is not held in a high amount of esteem, and I think that he's a very decent fighter. I thought that at the time he was a A-minus level fighter. So that is something that I do think he's a little bit correct on. But that being stated, sometimes we also know who's an elite fighter and who isn't. But anyways, let's see. Crawford unified 2 divisions, became champion in 3 weight classes, beat the best welterweight of Zaren Spence, and then went up and he beat the biggest name in boxing in Canelo. Whether ESPN had him at #1 or #3 in any given year doesn't change a single thing about the body of work. Like, come on, bro. Well, once again, I understand what this man's trying to say, and I agree with him on certain points. What I will state is this. The reason why, I mentioned that is because this narrative that Crawford was, the consensus or undisputed #1 pound for pound fighter. You can't be the undisputed #1 pound for pound fighter when you're about 30 something and 0, and the best fighters that you fought have been Yuriorkis Gamboa and Victor Postol. You just can't be. Not when there's guys like, Lomachenko beating Gary Russell, Nicholas Walters, Guillermo Regañao, who was on the top 10 pound for pound list, and was undefeated, and also fought some other guys that were in high esteem as well. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but it just is what it is. But anyway, but that pretty much is about it. I thought that was a very interesting conversation. Let's see if there's any other comments that I can respond to. Um, let's see here. Uh, B. Wayne 87 says, typical Devin Bud Wilder fanboys continue to give their favorite American fighters passes. They don't give fighters like Rocky Marciano, Joe Calzaghe, Klitschko, Usyk, Loma, Medipack, or an Inoue. I agree with that. That's part of the reason why I do these videos, to talk about the same standards. They bitch, moan, and complain about how Inoue is high on the pound for pound list. But they were willing to put Steven Fulton in the top 5 if Fulton was going to defeat Inoue. So you have to be very careful, because people just implement their standards by whatever means necessary that they want to. Bud didn't defend his IBF mandatory at 147 or defend undisputed at 147 and 168. He ducked an entire division at 154. That's hot. I'm not going to go that far. I mean, I think Crawford beat Madrimov. I think that his plan was never to stay there that long. Now, if you want to criticize him for not fighting Tehran Boots Ennis, that's definitely up to you. What I will state is this. A lot of the criticism, overall, that Dante, for example, gave to Oleksandr Usyk for not fighting Fabio Wardley, I certainly don't hear any of those same criticisms, for, Terence Bud Crawford not fighting Tehran Boots Ennis. Now, Usyk, of course, is only in 1 weight class, but Dante didn't say, well, he needs to fight him because he still has the belts. What he said is that this is why we can't compare Usyk to other all-time mid-level heavyweights. So if we're going to do that, well, then why didn't Terence Bud Crawford need to fight Tehran Boots Ennis? That's the reason why I do a lot of these videos, because people love, with their favorite fighters, their career is already set in stone. But then when it comes to fighters that they don't like, anything can be incriminating against them. So that's why. Anyways, let's see. But I'm not going to claim that he ducked them. I'm just saying that he was out for bigger goals. Anyways, he backtracked about fighting at 168 against Laura and Yana Beck. He doesn't want Shiraz or Benavidez or Bivol, who isn't that big, for 175. Well, Crawford, it was pretty much always known, at least to me, that Crawford was not going to do anything else other than fight Canelo. Because whether people like to admit it or not, people can say, well, doubt Bud, Crawford will beat Benavidez. Crawford is not beating anyone like a Benavidez. Benavidez is like a light heavyweight. There's no fucking way. Canelo is someone that really is more of a middleweight fighter. So that's why I say, the reason why Crawford went after Canelo was because Canelo Alvarez was more similar in size to him than what people let on. If it would have been a legit super middleweight, even like a Hamza Shiraz, I guarantee you there's no way that Crawford takes that fight. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. Anyways, but let's see. And I don't expect Crawford to fight someone like a Shiraz or Benavidez or Bivol. It's too big. Anyways, this man says, Diddy Haney. Haney just ducked Zayas, Boots, and Ryan for Rolly. Well, I'm not really going to claim that he ducks those guys because, Devin Haney just recently fought at 147, unless he was talking all this smack about fighting those guys there. So I'm not going to claim that he's avoiding them. To be honest with you, I think Haney doesn't get enough credit, just in my personal view, for what he's done. But, of course, if he moves up to 154 and doesn't fight those guys, then yes, then we can start criticizing him. But Haney just recently got to 147 and won the title there. So, of course, it makes sense that he wants to unify. So I'm not really going to blame Devin Haney for that. But anyways, he ducked the champions at his weight to fight Ryan in the first place. He backtracked fighting Tank and Shakur after Loma, as well as ducking the Loma rematch. Well, I mean, Haney got the win, and I don't really blame him for that. But, that was a very close fight. But these channels and fanboys gathered there to ask fighters like Loma, Usyk, and Inoue to defend undisputed fight. All the mandatories run back-to-back rematches while their favorite American fighter gets to sit pretty LMAO. Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people, once again, they create excuses and standards for their favorite fighters. So I definitely agree with that. and a lot of the same standards that guys like Dante or Aki or certain guys like that, Bruce MFA, and that they instill upon Usyk or something like that. They will not instill upon Crawford or other guys like that. But anyway, let's see. Um, an elite top level fighter is typically defined as a world champion or top 5 to 10 contender in a major organization. Well, it depends. There's a difference between a great contender and elite level fighter. But anyways, major organization comprising of the top 1% of all professional fighters throughout a career of 45 to 55 fights. A high level contender may face 5 to 10 truly elite opponents in title or top contender bouts in his career. And I agree with that. That's not a bad point, which is why when people talk about this bullshit about these certain fighters, like, well, he's a great fighter, but does he have 67 title defenses against the best competition in the world? It's like, bro, like, no one has ever fucking done that. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you have these guys out here that are saying that Usyk, for example, that in order to be amongst the greats in the heavyweight, history, they needs to just defeat all these young guys. And don't get it twisted. I mean, of course, it would add to his resume. And I think that he would need, some more wins to be on the level of, say, a Lennox Lewis or Muhammad Ali for the heavyweight history. But to just claim that he's not an all-time great until he faces, all these killers, it doesn't make any sense. He beat HA, he beat Fury, he beat Dubois. And then on top of that, he beat the killers at the cruiserweight in a very talented cruiserweight era. So anyway, you know, but let's see. Oh, did I respond to that? Anyways, okay. Respect you too, G. Anyway, let's see. My man Baron Avola says, or Baron Avola, however you pronounce it, he says, Eve Boxing, or Eve Boxing, is the channel who came up with a very good, well constructed, and thorough methodology for ranking careers. It's about the science. It's about as scientific as it possible. I'll have to take a look at that, my man. Anyways, let's see. This fucking man's saying done, bro. Um, but let's see. There we go with Dontra again. Nice to see you back in my comment section. John Sean Boxing says, if people think you're a butt hater, then they haven't seen the rock solids, BTFBs and IBFPs, egos, Fernandes, fight films, etc. I agree with that. I mean, I'm always trying to give fighters their credit. It's just that I do hold Crawford to a very high standard because if we're going to rank someone as a clear number one pound for pound, then they have to have a high level of competition. But anyway. Bud does not have a Usyk level resume. They're comparable in my personal view. I just, I don't agree with this argument that Bud was, this undisputed pound for pound fighter for like the past decade. I think he was always in the conversation. But to just act like, Crawford was this guy who should have never been surpassed by Lomachenko or Canelo in the pound for pound rankings, and that it was just completely because of race. All that is horseshit, and also states something like, that Usyk or, that Crawford that in a way that he doesn't even have as close to a resume right now at the current age as what Crawford did at that age. I mean, of course, that's not true at all, but we just analyze that as well. But anyways, um, let's see. Let's see overall. To be best. That is true overall that Terrence Crawford has considered at one point in time, or that he was considered the best pound for pound fighter in the world by that of a Oleksandr Usyk. Does that mean that, is that enough of an argument for me to say that Crawford is over Usyk? Not necessarily. But like I said, Usyk and Crawford, in my view, they're both all-time great level fighters. I hold them, in a very similar standard, and I think that they're both around the same level. Just my view of it. But anyway, but let's see. Elite fighters often have to navigate through club and contender levels before earning opportunities to fight other elite competitors, meaning a large portion of a 50 fight career might be spent building up to rather than sustaining that elite level. I agree. And then that's perfectly fine because that's going to be the average, even great fighter's career. But the problem was with Crawford is that he was, when Lomachenko and Canelo were putting in work against A grade level fighters, he was still fighting guys like Aegis Kavalauskas and Mean Machine, who was Aegis Kavalauskas, Jeff Horn, and other guys like that. That was the problem, anyways. But let's see. I'll have to take a look at this British channel right here. There's an English guy who does breakdowns on all the top boxers' careers. He charts out all the opponents, when they fought, how long they fought, etc., etc., but still falls short of both Inoue and Usyk. Well, I would have to say that Inoue has done more, at least at this age. He's 2 times undisputed already, And on top of that, you can debate that he's fought more A-grade level fighters, and he's a 4-weight division champion by the age of being, what, 32? I think he turns 33 this year. So, yes, I mean, one could debate that Inoue has certainly done more at this day and age. And Usyk, I think that he has a comparable resume to Crawford. I just don't, agree with the narrative that, Crawford, that, you know, he was way above everyone else, especially when he wasn't fighting that high level of competition for a long time. But anyway, but anyways, uh, let's see this little conversation here. Inoue is not yet accomplished more than Terrence Bud Crawford. It depends on what you look at. If you're looking at the titles, if you're looking at undisputed, yes, he has. I don't always just count those because, of course, once again, the thing that I count the most is a level of competition. Now, in terms of a total career, no, he has not surpassed Terrence Bud Crawford in my personal view, nor has he surpassed that of an Oleksandr Usyk. But one thing I will say is that at the age of 32, yes, he probably has surpassed that of a Terrence Bud Crawford. At least at that respective age. But in a way, in order to keep that ranking, or in order to be, in the final end with that of a Crawford or an Usyk, he is going to have to defeat guys like Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, Bruce Shoo Shoo Carrington, more than likely, Judo Nakatani, guys like that. So, in a way, is he stacking up the Crawford or even surpassing him at this age? Yes. Is he someone that is actually above Crawford for an all-time career? At the moment, no. But anyway, but let's see. But yeah, but that pretty much is about it. I thought that some of these were very, very, very particularly interesting. But I agree that Inoue is going to have to defeat more pound for pound names. And I think that the Ring magazines especially wanted Juto Nakatani and kind of planted him there in order overall to make a stronger case for Inoue to possibly make a huge fight with them later on down the line. And Juto Nakatani is a huge fight. Of course, a lot of the channels that, do not want Inoue to be number one pound for pound and claiming that it's not a legacy fight. Obviously, it is. Now, you can claim that Nakatani maybe is not quite as good as, what a lot of people say that he is, but this still is a humongous fight. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. I thought that I would read y'all's comments. Thank y'all so much for commenting. Whether you agreed with me or disagreed with me, I got to take a break for now because my throat is sore and I'm still a little bit sick. But thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all on the next one.